Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to run down the history of USS Enterprise, which appears in World of Warships Legends as a Tier 7 carrier. My review of Enterprise should follow shortly, and once it is available you should see a link to it down in the description. So the history of the Enterprise is a high stakes game for any creator to try to do in short, because the Enterprise is the Enterprise. Apologies to my overseas viewers, but this may be the story of the single most impactful ship in the history of naval combat, which should explain the length of this video. It should also guarantee that I've messed something up, so get comfortable, get those keyboards ready, because we're going to be here for a while. The story of the Enterprise probably begins at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, when a couple of bicycle manufacturers made a thing that could be generously called an airplane. Within a decade, Eugene Ely launched a plane off of a warship for the first time. A few years later, Europe was at war, and in that war, above the hellscape of eastern France and Belgium, men fought desperate close combat and sometimes quite rudimentary versions of aerial combat. By the end of World War I, there was at least some interest in the systematic launch and recovery of seaplanes and wheeled aircraft from so-called cruiser velours. French for aviation cruiser being the birthplace of the CV designation. And that was obviously a consideration for several nations, since the development of these new ships was limited and controlled by the Washington Naval Treaty. Within the treaty, the major powers were granted 135,000 tons of carriers, with no individual carrier weighing more than 27,000 tons. There were a few major asterisks, one being exploited by the Japanese to create ultralight carriers that didn't presumably even count, but also that two hulls, then under construction, could be converted to aircraft carriers given a slightly higher weight limit of 33,000 tons. For the United States, the converted carriers were those of the Lexington-class battlecruisers, composing of Lady Lex and USS Saratoga. Among newly constructed carriers, most of the U.S. Navy's efforts were put into construction of the Yorktown class, with the USS Ranger and USS Wasp picking up the difference, with Ranger claiming pride of place as first purpose-built carrier class for the United States Navy. USS Enterprise was the second of three Yorktown-class carriers, with the third being USS Hornet. CV-6, USS Enterprise, was laid down in the Newport News Shipbuilding Company on July 16, 1934. A couple years later, she was christened by Lully Swanson, wife of the Secretary of the Navy, Claude Swanson, and launched on October 3, 1936. Enterprise commissioned into service on May 12, 1938. Her shakedown cruise would take her to Rio de Janeiro and back again. Though in Europe, and in particular Poland, World War II would start in September 1939 from the perspective of the United States. The war wouldn't officially begin for a few years. These initial carriers began participating in some of the fleet problems, starting with Fleet Problem 9 in 1929, which contemplated an attack against the Panama Canal, but which would help build U.S. carrier operational experience absent an actual war. Curiously though, a few of these fleet problems contemplated an attack on Hawaii, including Fleet Problem number 19, held in 1938 before the Enterprise had finished her shakedown, and Fleet Problem 21, the first and only fleet problem that Enterprise participated in, which also happened to be the last fleet problem executed. Luckily for Enterprise though, when the contemplated attack on Hawaii moved from possibility to reality on December 7, 1941, she was several hundred miles away, returning to Pearl as part of Task Force 8 under the command of then Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. A determined Halsey uttered one of his more colorful quotes and set the task force out in search of vengeance. In some ways, she was lucky not to find the Quito Butai, but Enterprise would lose 3 Wildcats to friendly fire and 7 SBDs to some combination of friendly and enemy fire. What is fortunate though is that at 6 carriers to 1, Enterprise would have been at a decided disadvantage in any engagement, and not finding the Japanese on that date allowed Enterprise to become one of the chief antagonists to Japan in the early war. Instead, Halsey pulled into port on December 8th, and within hours was taking Task Force 8 back to sea to patrol the Hawaiian Islands in the event of another Japanese attack, and scored her first vengeance 2 days later when she sank submarine I-70 on December 10th, then set out the next day in escort in attempts to reinforce Samoa. With the Philippines under attack, it was a difficult proposition to reinforce, and the concern was that the Japanese would continue their thrust into the South Pacific to attack Australia and New Zealand. With the battle line of the US Navy decimated, the first offensive action Enterprise would see were attacks against the Kwajalein anchorage in the Marshall Islands in February 1942. Her dive bombers damaged the light cruiser Katori, a mine layer, and a handful of Japanese merchant vessels. The Enterprise was able to retire with the loss of just 6 aircraft and only minor damage to the carrier herself. She would follow up this attack with a bombing mission against the occupied but fairly disorganized Wake Island 3 weeks later, then joining up with USS Saratoga for another raid against the Marcus Islands a week after that. While Enterprise had found some success, defeat looms large over the American mind. Admiral MacArthur is still leading a desperate and largely hopeless fight for the Philippines, and of course, these early raids couldn't erase the sting of December 7th. To combat that, some guy named Jimmy Doolittle came up with a perfectly insane proposition to fly B-25 Mitchell Air Force bombers off the deck of an itty-bitty carrier. Okay, no, carriers aren't small, but they're microscopic for US Army Air Force bombers. As luck would have it, Jimmy was lieutenant colonel, convinced the right people that it was possible, and Enterprise and Hornet were tasked with carrying out the attack. The idea here is that 16 of these bombers would take off, attack multiple targets in Japan, and then land in China. The Mitchells would take off from Hornet, with Enterprise providing scouting and aerial cover if necessary. Though the task force was spotted earlier than expected, had launched about 170 miles further from Japan than planned, and objectively probably did very little actual harm to the infrastructure of Japan, it sent a message, and as far as PR was concerned, it was a total coup. Enterprise would arrive at Pearl Harbor on April 25th, and just 5 days later she departed to support the original USS Lexington and Yorktown. But before she could get there, Lexington had been lost and Yorktown was badly damaged. Around this time, the big brains in the Office of Naval Intelligence had worked out that Japan was planning on attacking Midway. Through miraculous effort, Yorktown was repaired enough to function. She'd sail with Hornet and Enterprise to face down 4 carriers plus 2 light carriers and dozens of support craft intent on invading the small atoll. Starting on June 4th, 1942, the U.S. Navy would hand out one of the most stunning naval reversals in history to the Kido Butai, sending all 4 of the Japanese fleet carriers present to the bottom, with 2 carriers being credited to one particularly noteworthy aviator, Richard Halsey Best, probably better known as Dick Best, who scored a kill shot against both the carrier Akagi and Hiryu. The Kaga was sunk by dive bombers led by fellow Enterprise aviator Wade McCluskey. Though Yorktown would be lost in the battle alongside USS Hammond and 150 aircraft, Enterprise was a critical part of handing Japan a stunning defeat. And though far from ultimate victory, Midway serves as the dividing line between when Japan was on offense and when they would spend the rest of the war on defense. Enterprise got a month-long breather before moving in early August to the Solomon Islands to support marine operations. About 2 weeks after her arrival, the Japanese fleet was spotted about 200 miles north of Guadalcanal. Spotter aircraft from Enterprise were able to locate the Japanese carrier Ryujo, and after a few unsuccessful torpedo runs, aircraft from Saratoga would hit the enemy carrier with a torpedo and a 1,000-ton bomb. It was a costly battle for Enterprise, though, as the ship took 3 direct bomb hits, including this photo of a 500-pound bomb striking her deck, as well as several near misses. Combined, this would wound 74 and kill 95. Thanks to the work of her crew, though, while the Ryujo would flood and burn until she sank, Enterprise was saved and even sailed back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. She spent just over a month being patched up before being sent back into action, just in time for the Battle of Santa Cruz. It was the last battle she would fight alongside her sister, USS Hornet. Squaring off against 2 fleet carriers and 2 additional light carriers, Japanese carriers Shukaku and Zuiho were both heavily damaged in the carrier duel. Enterprise was hit twice, wounding 75 and killing another 44. Hornet got the worst of it though, hit by 3 bombs before taking a hit by a Val dive bomber, and by that I do mean the actual plane itself, and then 2 torpedoes. Surprisingly, Hornet nearly survived this. The ship was almost saved before being struck again by a torpedo and ultimately ordered to be scuttled. Though battered again, Enterprise remained in theater. This was by necessity since the Enterprise at that point was the only functional fleet carrier in the Pacific that was still in the fight, but the crew showed their stubborn determination by posting an infamous sign reading simply, "Enterprise versus Japan." In lieu of heading back for repairs, Enterprise took on 75 men from the construction battalions, otherwise known as CBs, and made do with the repairs that could be effected while underway and under attack. From here, she would provide air cover over Savo Island, where she helped to sink the Japanese battleship Hiei. She would stay until May 1943, when she could finally take a breather. She'd weathered the storm long enough for the first of the new class of carriers, USS Essex, to relieve her, and many more flat tops were on the horizon. When Enterprise returned to service in November of 1943, it would be as a pioneer of nighttime operations. Though conceptually very cool and a necessity of carrier operations now, apparently some of the aviators found this to be rather dull. Night operations weren't as showy and were often more defensive in nature, and remember, Enterprise has already sunk several Japanese carriers, and in the course of just 4 days at the Battle of Guadalcanal, had participated in sinking 16 ships while damaging another 8. So the participation and pace of operations was quite a bit different. In any case, the boys of the Big E made the best of it, launching the first radar-assisted night bombing raid from the carrier in February 1944 during Operation Hailstorm against Truk Atoll, damaging aircraft on the ground and performing nighttime torpedo attacks against ships anchored there. Enterprise is credited as downing 28 planes, destroying 33 more on the ground, and sinking valuable and rare Japanese oilers, which apparently caused such an inferno that the glow from the burning Japanese ships was observed over the horizon by USS South Dakota. Following those raids, it was off to targets in the West Carolines, and then to soften up targets in New Guinea in support of additional landings there. Then Enterprise would return to Truk. Since the raids weeks earlier had been so effective, there weren't many ships there, so just 2 support vessels were sank, and the raid was estimated to have destroyed an additional 148 aircraft. After that, it was off to Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas Islands. That operation began with Saipan. In a curious twist of fate, Commander William Martin from the Enterprise Air Wing was shot down, but he was able to bail out, and before he was rescued, he was able to observe how the Japanese had pre-sighted reefs along the islands for artillery fire. Enterprise came under attack during the battle, narrowly avoiding a torpedo, though she would take some damage when hit by a 40mm Bofors gun from her escort, sadly killing 1 and injuring another 26. In response, the Japanese set the majority of their remaining air assets to square off against the US fleet. The Enterprise was one of 7 US fleet carriers and 8 additional light carriers that would respond to the 3 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, plus additional land-based aircraft sent by Japan. Though the Japanese had been, occasionally and maybe half-heartedly, inviting a decisive naval battle among surface units, if there was ever a decisive battle for naval aviation fought, it was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where 900 US aircraft squared off against 450 carrier-based aircraft, backed up by another 300 land-based Japanese planes. By the end of the 2-day battle, Japan would lose about 90% of its carrier air wings, plus around 50 of those ground-based aircraft. Enterprise's air group was responsible for about 20 aerial kills, and the sinking of the Hio, 2 fleet oilers, and scoring additional hits against 3 more Japanese ships. It wasn't all clear skies for Enterprise herself, though, as she fell under attack and was narrowly missed several times. but the boys manning her AA would splash another 3 attackers. The cost to the US Navy was 130 planes in total, many of which were lost because attacks were launched at extreme range on the second day, and so the returning planes would arrive after dark. Vice Admiral Mitcher ordered the US carriers to turn on their lights to aid planes in finding any ship. In the chaos, Enterprise would take aboard around 25 additional aircraft from 6 different carriers. She'd have an opportunity to return to Pearl after the battle before heading back towards Iwo Jima. While the Marines and most of the fleet were occupied with that island, Enterprise made sure that the Japanese forces on Chichijima kept their heads down and minded their own business. She'd support landings in Peleliu and Anguar, then cover areas of the Philippines before participating in attacks on Okinawa, which saw several more auxiliary vessels sunk. In raids against Luzon, Enterprise came up against stiff resistance. Her air group claimed another 27 more kills, plus destroyed 24 planes on the ground for the cost of 3 Hellcats. By the time it was October 1944, and at that point the American forces were pushing into Leyte, the odds were getting pretty long for Japanese victory. Without a functional carrier arm and with dwindling fuel and other supplies, they were looking for a big reversal, and this time in earnest, that decisive battle. They launched Operation Show Go, which would result in the Battle of Leyte Gulf with its several component battles. One of those battles was the Battle of the Sibian Sea. Choosing the largest target, Helldivers from the Enterprise landed 4 armor-piercing bombs on Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, and therefore one of the largest battleships ever completed. A flight of 8 Avengers claimed 8 torpedo hits. Musashi was left to bleed out and was not observed to go down by any of the aircraft, but was later presumed sunk, giving Enterprise pride of place in not only helping to sink the first Japanese battleship of the war, but also, at that point, the largest. Planes from Enterprise would also engage other ships in the Southern Force, sinking Wakaba and damaging both Fuso and Yamashiro. Then, sailing north, she assisted in the Battle of Enganyo for good measure. Enterprise returned again to strike Luzon and claimed another 13 planes along the way, though she narrowly avoided what appeared to be an impromptu kamikaze from a damaged Zero. November 1944, Enterprise broke up an amphibious convoy headed for Leyte, which included 4 destroyers and 5 support ships. She got to return to Pearl for Christmas, and in January 1945, 4 patrols and attacks off Luzon and the Philippines again. And by that time, she was joined up under Admiral Mitcher's TF-58 again, sailing with 13 other carriers. Alongside the veteran night fighter Saratoga, she provided combat air patrol day and night. When Saratoga was badly damaged and forced to retire, Enterprise flew day and night operations for more than 7 days straight on her own, pausing for just an hour and 15 minutes on March 2nd, 1945 because of zero visibility conditions, before resuming that breakneck defensive pace. On March 18th, the Lucky E, one of her nicknames, was hit by a 550-pound bomb which skipped off the deck and hit the navigational bridge. It did kill a sailor and injure 2 others, but it also failed to explode. She was a bit less lucky 2 days later when she was straddled by 2 more close misses, which damaged her steering system. Even more unluckily, she lost 2 more planes on her own deck to supporting AA gunnery, which started a fire. That took 2 more of her planes with it and damaged her deck, some of her AA protection, and even caused internal fires. Thanks to the quality work of her damage control parties, though, these several chain reactions didn't take the whole ship with it, like the fate of some of the Japanese carriers Enterprise had defeated. She would have to retire, though, at that point for a week or so of repairs before returning to duty on April 5th, just in time for the Japanese to launch massed kamikaze attacks on the US fleet. Enterprise successfully fought off some of these attacks, but was struck by 1-0. The plane itself caused a good deal of damage to some of her AA mounts, and the bomb attached damaged her torpedo defense, ruptured her fuel tanks, and caused the carrier to take on about 3 inches of water aft. The crew effected repairs again, and for a brief bit of repairs headed to Ulithi for the umpteenth time that I probably haven't mentioned. As one of the only specialist night fighter carriers, though, she made a very quick return, and following USS Bunker Hill being damaged by yet more kamikazes, she became the flagship for Admiral Mitcher and headed out to try to combat the continued suicidal flights against American ships. In addition to flying Cap, she'd launch air raids against Japanese islands, only to suffer yet another strike by a Japanese kamikaze pilot, that punched a hole through her deck, killing 18 sailors and wounding another 68. The kamikaze's bomb fell into the ship, causing extensive structural damage. Thankfully, since she was geared for night operations, there wasn't excessive fuel or ammunition laying about, so again, top-rate American damage control saved the day. In spite of taking on an even worse list than before, she'd stay in formation for the time being, and in so doing received the highest praise from Admiral Mitcher. Relieved the following day, though, Enterprise departed again for more repairs. She would miss the final, bitter days of battle off Okinawa and learn of the end of the war while under repair. On day one, Enterprise had been there. At one point, she'd stood alone, Enterprise versus Japan. But the most legendary ship in U.S. naval history would end the war recovering from her latest wounds. During her service, Enterprise steamed more than 275,000 miles, which is a bit more than sailing 13 times around the world. Sank or assisted in sinking 71 ships, and her air group downed 911 planes. Add to that the less concrete impact of dozens of more ships damaged, hundreds of planes damaged or destroyed on land, and her position as pioneer in aviation that helped cement the U.S. Navy as world leader in naval aircraft operations. The ship and her crew would earn a total of 20 battle stars, Presidential Unit Citation, Naval Unit Commendation, and was presented a British Admiralty pennant for her service. Now, I want to say that in anticipation of Enterprise eventually entering the game, I have read a few books on Enterprise specifically, and so I realized that any summary that is less than a few hours long is really a bird's eye view of this ship. I will, though, recall particular attention to the Enterprise, America's fightingest ship and the men who helped win World War II, by Barrett Tillman. I remember this recount mostly for starting out with the soul-crushing recount of the ship's last days. Most of this is likely creative license and a gratuitously sad way to start the retelling of the ship. And let me be clear, there is, simply put, no ship more deserving of preservation than USS Enterprise. She was old, an interwar design that was less capable of conversion than many Essex-class ships that finished the war alongside her, and she was the most decorated ship of the war. In that way, she offered future Americans the opportunity to see the genuine article from what one would hope was the most costly conflict in all of human history. She served with distinction from the beginning of the war in the Pacific to its bitter end. That said, Enterprise is not named after a state, much less one that borders an ocean, and by the end of the war she was beat to hell and back. If you were paying attention, Enterprise was struck on at least 6 different occasions by 13 bombs, either directly or by near misses, if not by aircraft themselves. If you could move heaven and earth, it would be the perfect ship to preserve, and it turns out that probably would have been what it would have taken to keep her. And without belaboring the issue, even the greatest generation could not save the ship from those sorts of long odds. Enterprise was deactivated in January 1946 after serving her part in Operation Magic Carpet, returning Allied service members to their homes. She was decommissioned on February 17, 1947, though several attempts were made to save her. On July 1, 1958, she was sold for scrap. Though CV-6 would see its end at the hands of the Lipset Corporation of New York City, Enterprise ensured such an enduring legacy that CV-65, America's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, would bear her name. CV-65 would serve from 1961 until 2017. That might not be surprising. CV-6 wasn't the first Enterprise. In fact, she was the 7th. But where carrier naming conventions are concerned, the U.S. Navy has trended, I might say annoyingly, into naming its carriers after people. And by that I mean mostly presidents. So strong, though, is the association between Enterprise and naval aviation that when CV-80 is scheduled to enter service in 2029, she will be the only carrier that isn't named after someone, while her contemporary namesakes in World War II have been assigned to other ships. And while we can all mourn USS Ranger here, quite a few aren't represented in the fleet at all. So it's no surprise the name Enterprise has seeped into other popular culture, with Gene Roddenberry choosing the name of NCC-1701, USS Enterprise. And obviously I mean here the original Enterprise in the 1966 version of Star Trek, rather than the spacefaring cruise liner that is the D version. In a way, aviation and exploration by extension is so inextricably linked to Enterprise that the first space shuttle was named after the original Enterprise from Star Trek, which, being a thing that's named after the thing that we're talking about, is near enough correlation to mention here. It's also worth mentioning that Enterprise rental car, somewhat lesser association, was also named in honor of the carrier by its founder, Jack Taylor, who was an F-6F Hellcat pilot during the war and serving part of his career on Enterprise. And with any luck, the crew of the Enterprise will serve with honor and distinction these United States for generations to come, but that is the history of CV-6. At least in short, and not really that short. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you're most mad about, or happy about, I guess, possibly, in the comments. I will make sure to link the video to my review once it is available. It's mostly pointless. And of course, I'll see you on the next one.